I never should have opened it. I should have known better. But curiosity gnawed at me like a persistent itch I couldn't ignore, a temptation that felt too strong to resist. When I found the crumpled piece of paper in the cup holder of my car, I thought it was just a receipt. But as soon as I unfolded it, the words hit me like a punch to the gut. I can't wait to see you again, my love. You make everything feel possible. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't addressed to me. And worse, it was in a handwriting I didn't recognize. I blinked hard, hoping to push the panic rising in my chest back down. But the more I stared at the note, the more it refused to let me go. I could feel my pulse quickening, a wave of disbelief sweeping over me. What was this? Who was it for? My fingers shook as I held the paper, its edges crinkling under the pressure of my grip. I felt as though I had stepped into a parallel reality, one where everything I thought I knew was starting to splinter and fall apart. I tried to calm myself, to reason with the voice in my head telling me not to jump to conclusions. But how could I not? How could I ignore the undeniable truth that this note was not for me? It didn't take a genius to realize that much. The words were intimate, affectionate, too affectionate for anything other than a secret love. But I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. For a few moments, the world seemed to tilt, and all I could hear was the thudding of my own heart in my ears. I glanced around the car, half expecting to see someone in the backseat, to hear the sound of a door slamming shut behind me. But the car was empty. I was alone. I felt a cold sweat forming on my brow as I stared at the note again, trying to make sense of it, trying to convince myself that there was an explanation. Maybe it was an old note, one I had forgotten about. Maybe it wasn't even meant for me at all. But the sinking feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. This wasn't just any note. This was a message, a secret, a glimpse into something I wasn't meant to see. I couldn't stop myself from reading it again. I can't wait to see you again, my love. You make everything feel possible. The words felt like they were echoing in my mind, like a siren call pulling me further into a sea of questions I wasn't ready to dive into. I thought about my husband, Dan. We'd been together for almost 10 years now, married for 6. We had a life built on routines, on the steady rhythm of work and home, kids and bills, the things that make up the quiet lull of daily life. I loved him. I still loved him. But this note didn't fit. It didn't belong to the life we had built. It felt like an intrusion, like I had found a piece of someone else's world, one that didn't include me. I pressed the note to my chest, trying to steady my breathing. I told myself that this was a mistake, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew. I knew that something had changed, even if I couldn't explain exactly what it was. And suddenly, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than I was willing to admit. The more I tried to push it away, the stronger the pull became. I thought about all the late nights Dan had been working. The long hours at the office, the business trips, the conferences that never seemed to end. I thought about the way he had been distracted lately, the small, subtle things that didn't seem like a big deal at first but had started to pile up. The forgotten phone calls, the lingering texts, the vague answers when I asked where he had been. And now, this. The note. The secret love. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed to know what this was. I needed to understand why I had found this note, why it had been left for me to see. I folded it carefully and shoved it into my purse, hoping the weight of it would somehow lessen if I ignored it. But I knew better. I knew that once a door was opened, there was no going back. The questions would keep coming, and the answers would only lead to more questions. I felt like I had stepped into a maze, one I had no choice but to navigate, even if I didn't want to. I closed the car door and locked it, my hands still shaking as I walked back to the house. I could hear the sounds of life inside, Dan talking to the kids, the hum of the television, the laughter that used to fill me with warmth. But today, it felt hollow. Today, it felt like a facade. And the note in my purse felt like the only thing that was real. I stepped inside, trying to act normal, trying to pretend like I hadn't just uncovered something I wasn't supposed to see. But I couldn't stop thinking about the note. I couldn't stop thinking about him. Whoever he was. Whoever had written those words to my husband. I spent the rest of the evening with a smile plastered on my face, trying to act like everything was fine. Dan was talking about work, his usual chatter about the office, the new project, the upcoming meetings. I nodded along, offering the right responses, the ones that kept the conversation flowing without drawing any suspicion. The kids were laughing in the background, their chatter filling the air like an innocent melody. It was supposed to be a normal night, a calm night, but nothing felt normal anymore. All I could think about was the note. As I busied myself with dinner, trying to push the thoughts out of my head, my fingers brushed against the edge of my purse. The crinkled paper was still there. I could feel it, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I told myself I should throw it away, forget it ever happened, but I couldn't. I had to know. I had to understand what was going on. But how could I even begin? How could I ask him about it without sounding crazy? Without revealing that I had been snooping through his things, looking for something that maybe wasn't even there? What if I was wrong? What if it was just some innocent note from a colleague or a friend? What if I was reading too much into it? The thought that I could be overreacting made me pause. I stared down at the stove, the simmering pot of pasta in front of me. I had to be rational. But the nagging doubt kept clawing at me, gnawing at my insides. I couldn't push it away. Not anymore. "Dinner's ready," I called, trying to sound normal. Dan and the kids came to the table, and we all sat down, digging into our plates like we had done 100 times before. But it felt different now, like there was a wall between us that hadn't been there before. I looked at Dan, at his smiling face, the way he laughed with the kids, the way he spoke to me so casually. How long had he been hiding whatever this was? Was he really here with us, or was he already somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't reach? I kept my eyes on my plate, pushing my food around without really eating. My stomach was in knots. I knew the questions were coming, but I didn't know how to answer them. Did I confront him? Did I ask him about the note? Or was I simply being paranoid? The kids were oblivious, thankfully. Their laughter, their excitement, their innocence, everything felt like a mask for the truth that I wasn't ready to face. I wanted to hold on to the illusion of a happy family. I wanted to believe that everything was fine, that this was just some weird misunderstanding. But the more I thought about it, the less sure I was. When we finished eating, I excused myself to clean up, needing a moment away from Dan. The house suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. The silence between us was heavier than I realized, like an unspoken tension that had always been there but now felt impossible to ignore. I headed into the kitchen, scrubbing the dishes harder than necessary. I needed to do something to keep my mind occupied, something that didn't involve thinking about the note. But the problem was, I couldn't stop thinking about it. My fingers trembled as I placed a plate in the drying rack, the thought of him, of someone else, lingering in my mind. The note had turned everything upside down. I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. I had always trusted Dan. He was my rock, my partner. We had been through so much together, the highs and the lows. The thought of him betraying me, of him being with someone else, seemed impossible. But the note had shattered that illusion. I turned around as I heard him approach from behind, his footsteps soft on the floor. He was standing in the doorway, watching me with that familiar look in his eyes, the one he gave me when he wanted something, when he needed something. But today, I couldn't read him. Today, everything about him felt foreign. "I'll help you with that," Dan said, his voice casual. "No, it's fine. I've got it," I replied quickly, wiping my hands on a towel, avoiding his gaze. There was a moment of silence before he spoke again. "Are you okay?" His voice softened, and I could hear the concern in it, but it only made my stomach twist even more. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah. Just tired, I guess." He stepped closer, putting a hand on my shoulder, but it felt like a stranger's touch. "You're sure? You've seemed a little off lately." I froze at his words. A little off? That was the understatement of the year. But I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. Not yet. I wasn't ready. Not until I knew for sure what was going on. "I'm fine," I muttered, and for a second, I almost believed it myself. But the words didn't come out with the usual conviction. I wasn't fine. Not even close. I couldn't help the growing knot in my chest. There was something missing, something big. "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me," Dan said, rubbing my shoulder one last time before pulling away. I watched him leave the kitchen, my heart sinking deeper. I turned my gaze back to the sink, my hand still gripping the dish towel. I wanted to scream, to let out all the frustration, the confusion, the hurt. But all I could do was stand there, lost in my own thoughts, wondering how everything had come to this. Was I being foolish for considering the possibility that Dan might be having an affair? Was I wrong to question the love we shared? I loved him. I still loved him. But what if it wasn't enough anymore? What if I had been blind to the things I didn't want to see? I needed to find out the truth. I couldn't live in this limbo, not knowing. The question was, how far was I willing to go to uncover it? How much of my own heart could I sacrifice to get answers? I turned off the faucet and dried my hands, feeling the coolness of the towel against my skin. I walked back into the living room, but everything was different. The house felt like a stranger's home, the air thick with unspoken words. I sat down on the couch next to Dan, forcing myself to breathe steadily, to keep my mind from spiraling out of control. But the knot in my chest remained. And I knew that no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't undo what I had seen. The next few days passed in a blur of routine. I kept my interactions with Dan as normal as I could, even though everything inside me felt off. I was careful, always conscious of the distance between us, of the way I could no longer look at him without wondering what he was hiding from me. The note in my purse was a constant reminder, a silent weight I couldn't shake. Every time I saw him, every time I tried to pretend everything was fine, the note haunted me. It taunted me with the truth I wasn't ready to face. I found myself retreating into my own thoughts more and more. At night, when the house was quiet, I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? Was it all in my head? Or was Dan hiding something from me, something bigger than I could imagine? The silence between us was suffocating. Every conversation felt like a performance, every laugh forced. I was exhausted from pretending. But I couldn't bring myself to confront him yet. I wasn't ready to hear the truth. What if I was wrong? What if I misinterpreted everything? What if the note wasn't even his, and I was just being paranoid? I didn't want to risk losing everything if it turned out to be nothing. But at the same time, I couldn't let it go. I needed answers. My thoughts were interrupted when I found myself in the car again. It was a Saturday morning, and I had planned to run a few errands. I had told Dan I was going to pick up groceries, but the truth was, I was driving around aimlessly. I couldn't sit still, couldn't be alone with my thoughts. I needed a distraction, anything to keep my mind occupied. So, I drove. As I turned a corner, my eyes fell on a familiar street. The street where he had been. The one where I had seen him standing just a few days ago, talking to that woman. I hadn't told Dan about it yet. I wasn't sure if I should. Was it a coincidence? Or was it something more? I couldn't resist. I parked the car a few blocks away, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself I was just being cautious, just making sure everything was okay. But I knew deep down that I was looking for something, anything that could give me the answers I needed. I walked down the street, my eyes scanning every face, every corner. It felt like I was on some kind of covert mission, creeping around in the shadows, trying to catch someone doing something they shouldn't. The thought made my stomach twist. I never thought I would find myself in this position, looking for signs of betrayal. But there I was. I stopped in front of a small cafe, my heart racing as I peered inside. I couldn't see much through the window, just the usual morning crowd, sipping their coffee and chatting. But then, something caught my eye. A figure sitting in the back corner, their back to the window. It wasn't Dan, but the woman from the other day. The one he had been talking to. My pulse quickened. What was she doing here? Was she waiting for him? Was she waiting for someone? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. My mind was already spinning, but I couldn't let my emotions get the best of me. I couldn't just charge in there and confront her. That would only make things worse. I needed to be smart about this. I pulled my phone from my purse, my hands shaking as I snapped a quick photo of her through the window. I didn't know why, but it felt like the right thing to do. I wasn't sure what I was planning to do with the photo, but having it made me feel like I had some control, like I wasn't completely powerless in this situation. I turned around and walked back to my car, the weight of my decision sinking in. What if I was wrong? What if this was just a coincidence? But deep down, I knew that I wasn't wrong. I knew there was something more to this, something I couldn't ignore. I drove back home, the photo of the woman sitting in my phone like a secret I wasn't ready to share. I didn't know what to do next. Confronting Dan seemed like the only option, but I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. I wasn't sure I ever would be. When I got home, Dan was sitting in the living room, watching TV. He smiled at me when I walked in, his expression warm, familiar. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at a stranger. The man I thought I knew felt like a shadow of himself, a version of him that was slipping away from me. I put my purse down on the kitchen counter, my fingers brushing against the edges of the love note. It was still there. The note was still there, taunting me, reminding me that I wasn't crazy, that something was wrong. Dan's voice interrupted my thoughts. You okay? I turned around to look at him. There was that concerned look again, the one that made my heart ache. Was he really concerned? Or was it just an act? Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. Just tired. He nodded and went back to watching TV. But I couldn't stop staring at him, studying his every move. I was looking for something, some sign, some indication that he was hiding something from me. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find. But I knew that I couldn't keep living in this uncertainty. I went to the bedroom and locked the door behind me. The silence felt unbearable, like I was trapped in a cage, unable to escape. I took out my phone and looked at the photo of the woman again. It was grainy, but there was no mistaking it. She was the same woman I had seen him with the other day. My heart sank. I couldn't keep living this lie. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I had to know the truth. I had to face whatever it was that Dan was hiding. I wasn't sure how, but I knew it was time to confront him. Time to confront the lies that had been building between us for so long. I took a deep breath and put my phone down, the weight of the decision settling in my chest. There was no going back now. I didn't sleep that night. I kept tossing and turning, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I could feel it in my bones, the uncertainty, the anxiety, the sense that my world was teetering on the edge of collapse. I knew what I had to do, but the fear kept me from acting. The thought of confronting Dan, of ripping open the fragile veil we'd built around us, made me feel both nauseous and suffocated. But the truth was clear now. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I woke up early, my heart pounding as I stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but I could hear the faint chirp of birds outside. It should have been a peaceful moment, but it wasn't. I wasn't sure when the calm would return, if it would at all. Dan was still asleep when I got out of bed. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching him for a moment, his face soft in slumber, the peaceful look of someone unaware of the storm that was brewing in the next room. I wanted to wake him, to confront him right then, but I couldn't. I wasn't ready. I wasn't strong enough to face whatever was going to happen once I spoke the words that had been building in my chest. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window. The morning light spilled across the room, but it did little to warm the cold pit in my stomach. The house was still, the silence almost unbearable. I could feel the tension hanging in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating everything in its path. I had to do it. I had to ask him. I had to know the truth. My hands shook as I wrapped my fingers around the ceramic mug, the heat of it offering some small comfort. By the time Dan finally woke up and shuffled into the kitchen, I had steeled myself for the confrontation. His hair was messy, his eyes still sleepy. He smiled at me, that familiar smile that made my heart ache with longing, and I forced a smile back, though it felt like it was made of porcelain, fragile and cracked. "Morning," he said, his voice raspy with sleep. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The words I needed to say were stuck in my throat, and I had no idea how to spit them out without shattering everything. But I had to. "You've been distant lately," I said, my voice quiet but firm. It was a statement, not a question, but I could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. He paused, his hand hovering over the coffee pot as he poured himself a cup. "I'm not, what do you mean?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the strain in his voice. I set the mug down on the table, the clink of porcelain echoing in the stillness. "I saw the woman," I said, the words finally tumbling out, heavy and sharp. "The one you've been meeting with. Who is she, Dan?" His face went pale. His hand shook slightly as he set the coffee pot down. For a moment, I thought he might speak, but then the silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. He opened his mouth as if to say something but stopped himself, looking away. His eyes flickered toward the door, as if he was contemplating an escape. "Who is she?" I repeated, my voice more demanding now, no longer willing to let him sidestep the question. Dan's jaw tightened, and he finally turned to face me. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice low and defensive. "I never meant for you to see her." Then why didn't you tell me?" I cut him off, my frustration spilling over. "Why have you been hiding her from me, Dan? Why keep a secret like that? Why did you lie?" "I wasn't lying," he insisted, but his eyes were shifty, his hands wringing together in a nervous gesture that I had never seen in him before. "I swear, it's not what you think. She's just someone I've been talking to for work." "For work?" My voice rose, and I could feel the heat of anger creeping up my neck. "You expect me to believe that? You've been talking to her for work? In secret, Dan?" I saw his shoulders slump, the weight of whatever he had been hiding finally sinking in. He ran a hand through his hair, his gaze shifting to the floor. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said quietly. "I never meant for any of this to happen." A bitter laugh escaped me, and I shook my head. Well, it's a little late for that, don't you think? You've been sneaking around behind my back, and now you expect me to believe that it's all just some work thing? I'm not stupid, Dan. I saw the way you were with her. And I saw the way you've been with me, too. Cold. Distant. Like I don't even matter anymore. His face crumpled at my words, and for a moment, I saw the man I had once loved, someone who was broken, not by her, but by his own guilt. His shoulders trembled as he let out a shaky breath. It's not like that, he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to hurt you. I never wanted to hurt you. But I made a mistake. I folded my arms across my chest, feeling like the walls of the house were closing in around me. A mistake? I asked, the word dripping with disdain. Is that all it was, Dan? A mistake? You've been sneaking around for months, and now you're telling me it's just a mistake? You've been lying to me. Hiding things from me. And you think a mistake is going to fix it? He took a step toward me, his hands outstretched, as if to plead for understanding, but I stepped back. No. You don't get to make excuses anymore. You don't get to make this go away with a few words. I need the truth, Dan. All of it. He closed his eyes, his voice breaking as he spoke. I'm sorry. I never wanted this to happen. I got caught up. And I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to tell you. For a moment, I saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the raw honesty that I hadn't seen in him for a long time. And despite my anger, despite the hurt that was consuming me, I could feel the small flicker of sympathy in my chest. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to erase the betrayal, to erase the way he had made me feel small, insignificant. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. I don't know if I even want to. Dan opened his mouth to speak, but I held up my hand, silencing him. I need space, Dan. I need time to figure this out. He nodded slowly, his face pale and stricken, like he was already losing me, and he knew it. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, broken and regretful. The weight of the moment pressed on me, and I felt 1,000 emotions crashing through me all at once. Betrayal. Confusion. Pain. But above all, I felt the overwhelming need to take control of my life again. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing, I couldn't keep living in the shadows of his lies. It was time to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I spent the next few days trying to clear my head, but the weight of everything pressing on me was suffocating. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. All I could do was replay everything, the little things, the signs I had missed, the strange way he had become distant, the long hours at work, the quiet whispers and secretive glances. I kept asking myself, when did it all change? When did I stop noticing? The answers kept slipping through my fingers like sand. Dan hadn't pushed. He hadn't pleaded. He gave me the space I'd asked for, and part of me admired him for it, even though I hated him for it at the same time. He knew that the damage was done and that no amount of begging would erase the hurt. I think deep down, he knew it wasn't a mistake anymore, it was a choice, a deliberate decision he'd made, and he had to live with the consequences. But living with those consequences wasn't something I was ready for yet. I wasn't ready to let him go, but I wasn't sure I could stay with him either. I was caught in an impossible tug-of-war between what I thought I should do, what my heart was telling me, and what my head was screaming at me. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about everything that had led up to it. The years of putting my needs aside, of ignoring the small cracks in our relationship because it was easier to pretend that everything was fine. The truth was, we had both allowed it to get to this point. I had been so focused on keeping the peace, on holding our family together, that I had neglected the foundation we had built. And he had taken advantage of that, not necessarily in malicious intent, but in his own selfish way. I needed clarity. I needed to feel like I was in control of my own life again, like I wasn't a victim of his mistakes or my own. So, after 3 days of avoidance, I knew I had to face him. I couldn't go on like this. I had to hear him out one last time, to see if there was any real remorse behind his actions, any hope of repair. But I couldn't do it in the house. Not after everything that had happened here. I needed to be somewhere else, somewhere neutral. Somewhere where the weight of the walls wouldn't make me feel suffocated. I called him that morning. Dan, we need to talk, I said, my voice steady but strained. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a breath he hadn't been holding just seconds before. Where? Not here. Meet me at the park. You know the one. The bench by the lake. I didn't give him time to respond, just hung up before he could protest. It wasn't that I didn't want to hear him out, I just couldn't be in that house, with all the memories of what we had. The house we'd built our lives in, the place where the lies had festered, was too suffocating. I needed a fresh start, even if only for the next hour. The park was quiet that morning, the kind of stillness that only the early hours could bring. The sun was low, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, and the water in the lake shimmered under the first light of the day. It was beautiful, serene, everything I wasn't feeling. But I focused on it, forcing myself to breathe, to find a moment of calm in the chaos of my emotions. I saw Dan approaching from the parking lot, his figure small and distant, and my heart ached at the sight of him. He looked so different now, worn out, exhausted, like the weight of the last few days had crushed him. His usual confident stride was gone, replaced by a cautious, almost defeated pace. I stood up from the bench, my legs shaky, unsure of how I should greet him, if I should greet him at all. But we had to do this. "Hey," I said, my voice soft. I didn't want to sound angry, even though I was. I didn't want to sound broken, even though I felt that way. He nodded, his gaze flickering to the ground, to the bench, to anything but my eyes. "Hey," he replied, his voice rough, tired. We stood there in silence for a long moment. It felt like a lifetime. The air between us was thick, charged with unsaid words, regrets, and the weight of everything that had gone wrong. "Why?" I asked, my voice catching in my throat. It was the one question that had been haunting me for days. The only one that mattered. "Why did you do it?" Dan finally looked up at me, his eyes filled with guilt and sorrow. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He shut it again, as if he couldn't find the right way to explain himself, like everything he said would just make it worse. And maybe it would. Maybe there was nothing he could say that would justify what he had done. I don't know," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't know. I got caught up in something. I don't know. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I never meant for any of this to hurt you." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in his every movement. "I never wanted to lose you. But I did. I fucked up, and now I don't know how to fix it." I swallowed hard, biting my lip. "I don't know if it can be fixed," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." He stepped closer, his hand hovering near mine, like he wanted to reach out but didn't know if he had the right. Please, don't say that." His voice cracked. I love you. I love you so much. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I swear I'll do anything. Anything to make it right." The sincerity in his voice almost made me want to believe him. Almost. But the truth was, I wasn't sure what I wanted anymore. Could I forgive him? Could I look past the lies, the deceit, the heartbreak? Or had he broken something inside of me that couldn't be repaired? "I need time, Dan," I said softly, my voice steady but uncertain. "I need time to think. To figure out what I want. But I can't promise anything. I'm not sure I even want to try anymore." I could see the pain in his eyes, but I also saw a flicker of hope. He was still holding on to that sliver of a chance that we might find our way back to each other. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure that I wanted to take that chance. I turned to leave, my steps slow but purposeful. As I walked away from him, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. The air felt lighter, but my heart still felt heavy. I had to make a decision, but I wasn't ready yet. I needed more time. But for the first time in days, I felt like I was finally taking control.